All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the Secure Fast Track Series webinar, which covers continuous risk assessments. So these are one of many webinars that we'll be hosting. In the interest of time, we're going to probably run this through in about 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll kick off. So really, if you're looking for further information as well, it is available via the Secure website and media channels such as YouTube. But equally, Alec and myself are the two presenters today. You have our email addresses and contact details there, so please feel free to reach out and we'll go into a bit more detail. So again, the intention of this webinar is to cover off a high-level overview of some of the topics and recommendations, but it's not a webinar to go detail into the various topics and bits and pieces. So let's kick off. So the first thing is really some house rules around here. So we do have a Q&A panel at the very bottom of your screen, so please feel free to ask any questions during the session and we will answer all questions at the very end. Everyone will be muted to ensure that we have any distractions or noise minimised. And also the webinar will be recorded, so if you would like to watch this again, we will upload this onto media channels, so please have a look out for that. So before we kick off, really just a couple of definitions. So this webinar is really about looking at continuous risk assessments, and one of the important aspects of doing those is to look at a couple of definitions around that space. So one of them is around cybersecurity assessment, and this is a good one from NIST and provides some information on basically being able to find the enterprise's network information and various assets to identify what capabilities exist in place and what are the ways to manage that defence or reactions against those particular assets. So really it's just an identification of what you have out there and how the organisation, from a people, process and tools perspective, is able to respond to any situations or risk events. Also on the right-hand side, we have APRA. So CPS 234 is a recent legislation that has come into effect, which is basically for all APRA entities. But there is a good objective definition in there, which actually talks about it's really the objective of these cybersecurity assessments is to minimise the likelihood of and impact of these security incidents. So really it's about the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity and availability of information assets. And that's what really we're protecting at the end of the day with all of this. If we look at, some of the business challenges associated with this space. So again, our focus here is around risk assessments and vulnerability management. And if you look at the Telstra Security Report for 2018, it's a very good report that gives basically some overviews and summary information of the various organisations across APAC and Australia. You can see on the right-hand side there are some listed challenges. On the left-hand side, we have our own observations as well, working with many organisations. So you can see that some of them are people-orientated, so lack of skilled people is still quite an issue in the industry as we speak in 2018. And of course, there are other areas such as things like patching. So everyone does patching, but the actual process of patching is quite trivial, but everyone has challenges with the before and after process. So for example, trying to get approval to apply the patch, getting board approval for any outages or any risks associated with it, any reboots, things like that. That whole change management process becomes the bugbear. The other area, of course, is detection. So lag time is still a key issue. Telstra's security report actually goes through the various sort of detection times that organisations in Australia have reported in terms of detecting incidents. Whilst we've improved quite a bit on that, there is around 5 to 10% of organisations still stating that they are unable to detect some insecurity incidents for a number of years. So it's quite a big issue there. And really it all comes back to vulnerability management and looking at how organisations are doing risk assessments as well. So here are a couple of questions you might want to consider. This is just some of the things that we find organisations probably missing in a certain aspect. And you can see on the right-hand side there, the key priorities are still around security audits, awareness programs and assessments of different systems. Probably part of that is to do with some of the compliance changes that have occurred recently with especially Australian legislation. But also I think organisations understand that there's still a lot of unknowns in their actual internal entities and assets, and having assessment done on those properly gives them a better indication of what their security posture is. So, we would encourage to look at some of those questions. There are many other questions, and of course, either Alec and myself are available to discuss this a bit further with you if you're interested, or have a look at our media channels online, which go through a bit more information. But the key thing here, really the key point, is to look at how attackers can actually infiltrate into your systems. So when doing a security audit, it's very handy to classify assets and understand their actual risk from an organisation perspective. But we still find many organisations are not looking at an attacker's perspective when trying to infiltrate into an organisation. And we'll talk through that very shortly. So let's move on to the first recommendation. So there are two recommendations in this webinar. The first one is to include continuous pen testing within your vulnerability management processes. So what we mean by continuous is that we find many organisations still running annual pen tests or quarterly pen tests. These are typically a once-off type of pen test which puts a report out and effectively is used as a checklist to say that the pen test has been done. We would encourage organisations to actually do regular or continuous pen testing, which is effectively as applications change or any changes that occur in the organisation itself and the assets, that a pen test is done. And there are many reasons for that. And what I want to do is basically just go back to a definition space, which to look at why this is such an important part of it. And if we just move away from IT itself and we look at the organisation as a whole, enterprise risk management applies to many different systems, not just cyber, but obviously across the organisation, the CEO, the executives are concerned with what risks are found in an organisation. Things like, currency fluctuations or things like accounting, fraud, etc. all come into it. And of course, the reason why is confidentiality, integrity, and the CIA triad are important because all of the information these days is really stored in IT systems and cyber systems. So ERM is all about a continuous assessment of risk and looking at what risks occur and what sort of things an organisation can do to minimise that or completely mitigate that risk. And the reason why I put that definition in there is because if we look at vulnerability management, that really works within the cybersecurity or the cyber practice. And again, it is about identifying and classifying different types of risks, but from this aspect, it's around vulnerabilities in systems, particularly software, as the definition states there. But I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is that vulnerability management is a very important part of an organisation's cyber risk profile. But one of the challenges that we are seeing is that it does identify really potential vulnerabilities and not the, I guess from an attacker's perspective, what those vulnerabilities are. So, I guess a lot of the organisations would see vulnerability management as running through scanners and VM or vulnerability scanners, and they identify many different types of vulnerabilities out in the different assets that organisations have. But at the end of the day, one of the key things to look at is around the pen testing space. So pen testing is different in the fact that it actually identifies weaknesses really using an attacker's perspective. So it's looking at different types of exploitable risks and how an attacker could actually get in. So running vulnerability management with pen testing on a continuous basis will provide you not only with the different types of vulnerabilities that exist in assets, but how a particular attacker can get in. You know, we are seeing many organisations not running pen testing continuously, and one of the challenges, perceived challenges that is, it could be the lack of skills inside the organisation. I mean, if this is what you see as a key challenge, please feel free to visit SecureAuth's website, which discusses some of the things that around the education perspective and what pen testing is and how that works. And you'll actually realise that it's actually not that far away from what your current team can do today. So that's just one of the things to look at. If we look at combining those two, so vulnerability management with continuous pen testing, this is sort of the process flow. So vulnerability assessments, which involve things like your scanners and pen tests, would both then give you the actual exploitable risk that you have. You have the ability then to implement compensating controls or any patches, etc. And then when you validate that, you're actually using pen testing and an attacker's viewpoint to validate whether those compensating controls, patches and so forth are actually working or not. So that's really the difference. You're putting an attacker's lens on it and identifying in practice, is this particular vulnerability and the various mechanisms we put into place, is that actually closed? So really what we're saying here is that, you know, look at vulnerability management and continuous pen testing as a combined set of value points here. And again, I mentioned that, you know, our website or the YouTube channel, for example, has various bits of information that go further detail into that as well. So with that, there's the second recommendation, which we'll have a demonstration shortly that Alec will run through. The recommendation 2 is to actually incorporate some of the things within vulnerability management into your access management processes. And to give you understanding of that, I know some people may be asking what is access management and what the definition is for that. Basically, it is to ensure that people receive the right access to the right resources at the right time, and of course for the right reasons as well. Access management is an end-to-end organisational perspective. So what I mean by that is it actually can serve as a way to protect and safeguard your information assets. If you think about access itself, it's either a person trying to access something inside your organisation, or it could be perhaps another computer resource through an API. But if you look at access as a whole, it really protects a lot of the information. So the key thing about this also is that if we look at modern access management, and we just simply look at the various pieces to it. So I'm just going to go very high level here, but on the left-hand side are the entities that are trying to access your systems. So it could be your staff, could be your business partners or supply chain, or perhaps your customers. And on the right-hand side are simply the access points. So these could be applications, these could be APIs, they could be different functions, such as perhaps if you provide self-service password reset to people or user registration functions. These are all access points as we define it. In the middle of that is what we term modern access management. So it involves using a risk-based approach. It's adaptive. So depending on the type of risk that is identified from whoever's trying to access the systems, it will be very adaptive. So people that are well known to the system, that are trustworthy, will get very seamless access. The ones that are deemed suspicious or malicious will either be given some sort of action, such as a step-up authentication, or they may be outright denied access to systems. Okay, so this is what we mean by that. And one of the key areas is things like looking at abnormal behaviour. And this is a key area here, because looking at someone's baseline patterns of behaviour versus abnormal behaviour can really serve to tell the difference between a actual employee or someone that's registered to use your systems versus that someone trying to get access through malicious means. Because typically the patterns of behaviour are different. So these are just some of the things you might want to look at in terms of having a modern access management approach. Now, one of the questions, of course, comes up is when you look at vulnerability management, there are also things that you'd like to place into, and we would recommend to place into access management. The reason why is because it really defines a level of trust or the level of risk, okay? So like I said before, low risk means that someone gets an easy access approach, so we give them the best experience. Someone that is at high risk may be outright denied. So, and these different aspects, in the previous slide I mentioned things like behaviour, serve as a way to define whether someone's trustworthy or not. Now, if you think about your own vulnerability management programs as well, there are there's a lot of information that exists in these different tool sets, such as your vulnerability scanners and so forth. So what we're recommending is that you integrate the information that you're bringing from vulnerability management into the access management using a modern access management approach. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, there's a couple of things there. So one of the things could be if a user's device is listed as vulnerable, so you've identified that in your VM program that these particular devices are vulnerable, you may want to place that information into access management. So the next time someone logs in with a vulnerable device, you may decide to perhaps step them up or reset the password or do something that would actually reduce the risk profile of that device. What we have here is an example, and Alec will show you very shortly, but we will focus on an approach that we're able to provide today with the various solutions, which is if a user has failed an internal phishing campaign, what sort of process would you imagine you would like to place them through that? So many organisations run phishing campaigns, and of course the output of that is whether someone passes that or fails that test. And we'll show you what the approach is when someone fails it. Another way to look at it is, it's really a continuous feedback loop. So if we look at the before aspect of it, we can see that the phished user leaks some credentials, and an attacker then can establish the foothold. And this is a diagram that I'm sure everyone on the line watching the webinar today is very familiar with, but effectively a leaked credential is actually used to access systems and escalate privileges and so forth. If we look at the with modern access management approach, what happens is that it's a slightly different approach. So basically, we identify that the phished user actually leaked credentials. Then we have the ability, with the modern access management approach, to automate the responses. So this might involve things like, you might want to reset the leaked password immediately. When the user next logs in, there's a forced password screen for them. You add them automatically to phishing training. And whilst they are still doing phishing training, in other words, they're a high-risk user, you step them up. So each time they log in, they have to put some sort of multi-factor authentication approach in to get access to systems. Okay. Once they've finished phishing training and you reduce their risk again, then they have a very excellent experience. So it's a bit of human behaviour plus automation on the back end of that helps to really automate this process. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand off to Alec, and Alec's going to run through an example of what we just discussed right there. So Alec, passing the mic to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Okay, so what we're going to run through, as has just been mentioned, is a demonstration of an authentication mechanism that, as has been highlighted, will make use of some of the more modern adaptive authentication capabilities. So first of all, we'll start with a user who's logging into a Windows machine. So this could be a Windows or a Mac desktop. And the example we're showing here is a user who's entering their username, and then at the next prompt, they're asked for their password. That was the standard steps for users logging into a desktop. And as we'll go through our demonstration, we'll highlight where our solution protects across the range of your environment, everything from endpoints such as Windows, Mac, Linux, SSH connections as well. So this is established across the whole realm of your environment, being end users logging in locally, as well as what we're about to see here, logging in through a web portal into a single sign-on environment. So here we've now got the next user logging in, same thing, username, password. This is at the internal portal that takes them to the single sign-on experience. So if you have an environment in which you've got an internal intranet, user logs in once, and from that point they can click the link and go to all the different applications that are available to them through that single sign-on mechanism. What we just saw was a sort of stock standard used by a lot of people, single sign-on with username, password at the front door. What we'll expand on later on is that there's options to make that a lot stronger, where we go through options of things like using passwordless. We can use multi-factor authentication. So also we'll get into the fact that there doesn't need to be a trade-off of usability for security. So you can increase the security of your environment without necessarily making things harder for people to use. As was addressed in this point, we're looking through a campaign where we're using a phishing mechanism tool. So as you can see on the screen at the moment, this is the interface through which we design our phishing campaign. What we've got here is client-side phishing with a web page clone. And so the intention is that the user who believes they're logging into their network environment is actually logging in to the web portal to get access to single sign-on. But what's going to happen is for this particular user here, as we can see in the attack, we're addressing a victim by sending him an email to his Yahoo email address. So this user's now received in his inbox in Yahoo an email that looks like it's come from the company security team. It says there are some issues, security policy compliance issues. Please click this link to go directly to the security portal to address that. Now, as you're probably all very familiar with, nearly every phishing campaign is kicked off by an email that basically says, click this link here, rather than go externally to the appropriate web portal or other location. So always it's driven by a click this link. Users who actually do that and follow the step, unawarely, in this case here, being taken into what is actually a mock-up or a fake URL. So this is a masquerading site that looks exactly alike to the live site. In our instance, you can see a slight difference. The name of the URL is a little different. In this case, the user is being presented with what they believe is the standard single sign-on web portal. What they will do at this screen, though, is they'll enter their credentials, and what they will be unaware of is that as they are doing that, because this is into the phishing site's dummy website, as they enter those credentials and hit submit, what's actually happening is in the back end, the system has taken that, or the phishing campaign has taken those credentials and recorded them, and then it's redirected the user to the actual correct target site that they were aiming for. From a user's point of view, if they're not aware of this or not very security savvy, to them it will just look like some kind of glitch where they've gone to log in, for some reason the page is refreshed and they have to do it again, not being aware that the first instance they saw was actually a complete fake mock-up of the target environment, and that now they're about to log into the actual destination environment. What we can see here is, again, just jumping into the phishing campaign tool, what just occurred in that interaction was during that attempted login by the user, their password was captured. So here we've captured their credential, being their username, password, and we've got that stored away. So our phishing campaign, from that point of view, was successful and collected the user's details. Here we've got the user continuing that step of going through what they think is just a recovery from the glitch, but in this case now they're actually logging in to the actual correct environment. Because of the phishing campaign capturing that data and feeding that data to our internal system, what's actually happened is that user's risk score, and this is just a quick glance at some of the mechanics under the bonnet and how this is enacted. The user's risk score has gone from down in the minimum space up higher. So as Rob touched on, this will invoke a requirement to do a step up, or basically raise the level of effort in which they need to authenticate. So here we've got, as an example, low risk user is they can just go through the standard workflow. If they've been stepped up so high at a high risk that we deem them very malicious or very unlikely to be a correct user, we can reject their authentication completely. But if they're in the risk category where we decide that it looks like they're a higher risk than standard, but not necessarily a definite intrusion, then we do in this case require the two-factor authentication. So what's happening here is This process, where they entered their username password, was stepped up. They were presented with a next factor to have to address, and in this case, it's using a multi-factor authentication, and we're choosing the send login request to their handset or their mobile phone. So this enacts the feature that we like to use, which is symbol to accept. You're possibly familiar with push to accept, where people are presented with a confirm or reject type option, or a positive negative experience on the phone. Already there are hackers that are smart enough to try and intercept that traffic and see what looks like a positive and what looks like a negative response. So the next level up, or the next level of intelligence, I guess, in this space is the fact that we prefer a model that's called symbol to accept. So the user only has to read the one character off the screen, press the matching character on their phone, which is just as easy as clicking yes. But in that case, if anyone was to try and hijack that traffic going between the phone and the system in the background, they'd see that there are 4 options to choose and wouldn't be any the wiser of what that was that the end user was actually validly choosing. So in this instance, once the user has done that, what's happening is the system, as per the feedback that came from the phishing campaign, as Rod touched on in an earlier slide, not only was this user flagged as being a higher risk, and therefore their actual access entry was stepped up to include the token-based or the phone-based multi-factor authentication, but the user's password has been flagged as needing to be reset. So the phishing campaign internally verified that users' credentials had obviously been given away, so here we know we need to do a password reset on top of their stepped-up authentication. This drives them through the password reset mechanism, which they're doing here. In they go into their single sign-on portal, as we saw before. One of the differences as well that was touched on earlier is that we can address the mechanism of ensuring that users become more savvy and more aware of this kind of attack by doing things like automatically enrolling them and using the provisioning engine to directly provision them into an anti-phishing training requirement, put that in through the single sign-on portal as well, so they automatically come in and see the anti-phishing training advertised kind of directly at them. That anti-phishing campaign can also be set as one of the components that says until that user has successfully completed that training, they're still on the higher risk list. So what we're seeing now is that same user, later on that day, the next morning, whenever it occurs, they log into the LAN, and again, they're logging here on their endpoint being a Windows or a Mac login. And when they do, they won't be asked to reset their password again because they already did that earlier, but they are still flagged as a high-risk user for the moment, and therefore continually being presented with that step-up authentication requiring that extra component, in this case of the multi-factor authentication, which will continue until such time as, again, the internal system using the intelligent security automation feeds back that knowledge that the user has successfully completed the phishing campaign, and for that, from that point forward, they can be stepped down to the standard level of authentication that's required. So here we'll see the user being continued through that extra level of authentication until they're completely given the all clear. And that's the end of the software walkthrough.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. So the final link that we have listed here is a good blog entry which discusses all the different aspects that we talked about today. So it's about continuously assessing risk and integrating vulnerability management with access management. So if there are any further questions, please feel free to add it into the Q&A panel, and we will endeavour to go through that at this point in time. Okay. All right, I would like to thank you for joining the webinar and wish you a great day. Thank you.